Scenes of unimaginable horror in Gaza, but Israel's near-total ban on media coverage has limited reporting on the war. Now, American politicians are urging the White House to pressure Israel to allow foreign journalists unrestricted access to Gaza. Will President Joe Biden listen? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem, Ahelbarra. The United Nations has described the situation in Gaza as apocalyptic, but Israel's restrictions on international journalists have allowed the military to carry out its genocide with impunity for more than a year. Politicians in the US are finally questioning that. Weeks before Americans elect a new president, dozens of Democrats from the House of Representatives have written to Joe Biden. They want him to intervene and push Israel for unrestricted independent media access to Gaza. Will the US president act, and how will this play out in campaigning ahead of the November the 5th election? We'll discuss these issues with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Mohammed Haji.
Journalists wearing clearly identifiable flak jackets, targeted and killed by the Israeli military. Their crime? Reporting on Israel's war on Gaza. The Strip is now the deadliest place in the world to be a journalist. Israeli forces have killed at least 177 media workers in the past year, in what critics say is an attempt to silence the truth. The Israeli government has barred most foreign media from entering Gaza. The few granted entry are embedded with the Israeli military.
This is utterly shocking. I mean, it clearly comes as part of a long, drawn-out policy to try and stop free reporting. There's been, journalists have been locked out of the Gaza Strip. There's obviously been the terrible targeting of journalists in Gaza. There's been suppression of critical media within Israel.
Al Jazeera journalists and their relatives have been attacked repeatedly. Israeli forces killed 5 family members of Gaza bureau chief Wael al-Dahdoh. Among them, his eldest son Hamza, also an Al Jazeera journalist. In July, an Israeli airstrike targeted the car of Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail al-Ghul, killing him.
This vest is praised by international institutions, but it did not protect our colleague Ismail or any other colleagues. You can see how this vest has become stained with Ismail's blood and some of his body parts. What did Ismail do to deserve this?
Earlier this month, an Israeli drone fired at Al Jazeera cameraman Fadi al-Wahidi, hitting him in the neck. He's now in a coma, and the Israeli military has refused to allow him to leave the Strip for urgent medical treatment. It's prompted US House Representative Jim McGovern to ask President Biden to put pressure on Israel. He says the restrictions on media have created challenges in obtaining accurate information from Gaza. In a letter signed by dozens of Democrats, he urged the administration to advocate for unrestricted media access to the Strip, saying a free press is essential to bear witness to the realities on the ground and hold all parties accountable. Palestinian journalists have long been on the front line of Israel's occupation. Now, they're paying the ultimate price. Mohammed Haji, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests from Washington, D.C. We're joined by Laura Albast, a fellow at the Institute for Palestinian Studies and a media analyst. In Dublin, Tim Dawson, the Deputy Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists, which represents 180 journalist unions around the world. And in New York is Ashish Prashar, a US political strategist and former advisor to the Middle East peace envoy, Tony Blair. Welcome to the program. Laura, will President Biden ever use his influence now to push for international media get access into Gaza?
I don't think so. I think that we're merely weeks away from the elections. Ever since he stepped down from being candidate for president and Kamala came into the picture, he sort of disappeared. He's no longer the chief of this country. He's no longer the one making the decisions. What matters now is the candidates and the elections, and the president seems not to have any power at all. He hasn't done anything in the past year and counting. He's not going to do anything right now.
Mm-hmm. Tim, so there's this letter by Democrats from the House of Representatives, but ultimately, are they going to be able to put any pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to say it's about time to let media into Gaza?
Well, I hope so. I think this seems like quite a significant development. And I wouldn't disagree that in public, Biden has fallen short of what we might have hoped for. However, we know, of course, that he is strongly allied with Israel. And as a consequence, I would expect that he has very different conversations with Benjamin Netanyahu in private to those that he has in public. And that is the nature of a diplomatic friend. I think quite such a large number of elected members of Congress making a point so boldly and so clearly will have an effect. And even if it doesn't have an effect on Joe Biden, I think it will have an effect on American public opinion. I think there are lots of people who consider themselves to be instinctive friends of Israel, supporters of Israel, who have increasingly over the past year felt that something really quite terrible is going on there, particularly to journalists. And to see it laid out in such simple and straightforward terms and supported by so many people, I think will be a step towards persuading a majority of Americans that something has to be done about the welfare of journalists in Gaza.
Ashish, you have a letter endorsed by 64 congressmen and spearheaded by the president, Jim McGovern. What kind of political weight does it carry within the Democratic establishment and the White House?
None. I don't think anything. I mean, we've had senators and congresspeople call out for a ceasefire. Not many, but still have. We've had people to ask for some sort of arms restrictions to enforce the ley law, a US law, that we are breaking every day by continually sending Israel bombs. This letter will be lost in the media cycle, right? While you are covering it, while other foreign networks are covering it domestically, is anyone covering it at scale? It should be a huge story. It should be on the front pages of newspapers. It should be a call to action for the president to act and give access to the media. But the reality is it's going to be buried in the election news every day, between Kamala and Trump. And, you know what US elections are like. They suck the oxygen out of every other story. So them doing this, I'm sure there was some good intent, and I'm sure they do want to see journalists have access to Gaza. But the reality is, I don't think it moves the needle. The president could have got access to journalists anytime he wanted to. But I also want to take a step back. Journalists could have got access anytime they really wanted to, right? Let's just be transparent. Doctors have managed to get in there. Medical people have managed to get in there. One or two undercover reports have been in there. If journalists really wanted to go and cover this and show the barbarity of Israel, if publications in the West wanted to show the atrocities that were taking place, they would have got people in there somehow at their own risk. But there were journalists who apparently were willing to do that in other conflicts like Syria, Iraq, and other places. So why weren't journalists wanting to go in there unless they were either told up high not to do that work and push the continued Israeli narrative that we're seeing right now?
Laura, should we blame media, trade unions for not doing what it takes to push for being there to tell the story for their viewers globally?
I think media organizations are 100% complicit in the genocide in Gaza. They've manufactured consent for everything we've been seeing over the past year. And some of these organizations have tried to cover Gaza. They've hired fixers on the ground. They license photos from the photojournalists being shot at and bombed, losing their families to Israeli airstrikes. They've tried to show a picture because they can't really avoid the atrocities. It's too much in our face. We're watching people burn alive. We're watching children being killed while they're playing on a beach. I think that media. We need to also look look at editorial policies at media organizations, yes, it's a problem. International journalists are unable to enter Gaza, but it's also a problem that media organizations in the US and in the West are anti-Palestinian, and they're racist, and they omit information, and they fabricate narratives that they then apologize for, but the news cycle has already passed, and the people have already believed those lies.
Tim, there were always wars and conflicts in different parts of the world, and particularly in this area. And each time the biggest question that would be asked is media going to be allowed to cover the different aspects of the story, except for Gaza? It took 1 year. Now people are saying we should have been there, we should go now, when many think it's too little, too late.
Well, I do find some of the statements made in the past few moments slightly bizarre. For a significant period of time, there were more than 20 international correspondents camped out at Rafah, petitioning to try and get into Gaza every day, using every wile that they could to get in. More than 100 of them signed a letter demanding the right. I know one or two of them personally, and I know them to be people of the greatest imaginable determination, journalists who would, get over any barrier, get through any obstacle. I have watched them at work and know that they do that. So I think to suggest that they somehow were colluding with not getting in is not an evidence-based assertion. I think plenty can be said about the coverage on major news platforms, and people with interests on both sides of this conflict have made accusations about the nature of the coverage. What actually I think is most striking is that all the material that we have, all the pictures we've seen, comes from Gazan journalists in Gaza who have suffered the most extraordinary onslaught on their lives, on their families, on their homes, and yet they have carried on with the most extraordinary determination to get pictures and stories out of Gaza, which comprise everything that we know about this conflict. And I have appeared on television scores of times in the past year, more times, than I can count. And always I am accompanied by pictures of the kind we're seeing on the screen now. Terrible, heartbreaking pictures of death and destruction in Gaza, all of which have been produced by Gazan journalists. It's never enough. It's never enough when slaughter is going on to put in front of the world. But I think we have to give reasonable credit to the journalists who have done, I believe, an outstanding job to tell the terrible story of this war.
Ashish, isn't this a case of double standards in the sense that when it's a top priority for the West, that this is a story where they have to have their own people there, then it becomes a top priority. But when it came to Gaza, sorry, it's not a top priority for us.
Well, actually, it is. I mean, the top priority is to continue. Look, I will tell you this. I'm going to take a step back and address some of my co-panelists' points. Media has been in bed with Israel in the United States. You might say that you know these individuals, and you might say that they're people of character, people of quality. Well, they've manufactured consent, including some of those individuals on the ground. There's no denying that none of the stuff that came out of October 7th, a lot of it's been debunked. All of the platforms that you represent have covered it in the West like it was the truth, complete truth, without any investigation. That is shocking. And when I worked for the Middle East Peace Envoy, your media outlets would only take the Israeli side of it. I can tell you that as someone who worked for the system. They would never take the Palestinian side of anything. That goes way back to 2010, 11, 12, when I worked in that role. There was only one side. So that my problem with everything you're saying is they might be good people. But when it comes to Palestinian lives, they've never shown an ounce of decency or care. Those individuals on the border, you say, petitioned. Famously, an activist, Rama Zain, called one of Clarissa Ward out for not trying hard enough. I don't believe she tried hard enough. Clarissa Ward is known for her ingenuity of getting into tight conflicts in Syria and everywhere else. She could have got in. CNN have the resources to make something happen. But to go answer your other point about double standards, the Western double standard has been exposed. It's every institution, right? They are absolutely in bed with Israel to ensure the extermination of everyone in Gaza, right? The reason they're getting blowback is because of those fantastic heroes, frankly. I don't even know what other words you could describe. Hero is not even the right word for those people who stayed in Gaza to show the world the atrocities, to the point where we have people like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden wanting to ban social media platforms because it's showing our youth, showing Western people what's actually happening. They want to ban TikTok because people learn about the atrocities the media failed to show. They want to restrict access to certain things on Instagram and keywords because, frankly, it's showing Israel for the barbarism state that it is. And the only reason you get blowback of it's not showing from the other side is when BBC or CNN might do one story that questions one thing like a burning child, which we can't get away from. They're like showing anti-Israeli bias. Are you kidding me? Considering the last year, considering what the media has set up, I've worked with many of those people that our esteemed colleague here has talked about, and they would literally have always, in their whole career, parroted the Israeli propaganda. You only have to watch Sky News, interviews with Mariam Barghouti, with ambassadors of Palestinian background, and they literally won't let them finish a sentence. That is the editorial policy.
Laura, the fact that media was not allowed into Gaza, do you see it as a political move, not necessarily only by the Israelis, but also by the West and the Americans, so that there's no notion of accountability whatsoever in the future?
You know, I'm not sure, but does it help the notion of not having accountability? Of course it does. I think the United States government thought that this is something that's going to disappear from the people's minds a year into the genocide. It has not. And so now they're having a stunt, a last-minute attempt to try and win people's minds in the United States, because an election is coming up. Let's not forget, an election is coming up. The Democrats want to win. The Democrats are trying to show public opinion that they still have a heart, but they forget that as they're running their candidate on memes and trends rather than political strategy, rather than empathy to the people in the United States, they forget that as people are scrolling through and watching photo ops and catchphrases by their candidate, right beneath that photo is a picture of doctors in white coats surrounded by dead Palestinian bodies that were killed by an Israeli airstrike. People are not stupid. Free people are committed to the freedom of Palestinians. I'm a Palestinian journalist myself, and I do want to thank my colleague Ashish, because honestly, people are also being silenced in media organizations, within newsrooms. If they say anything, if they try to quote someone, if they try to bring out a source, they're either shut down, an article is not promoted enough, or they're being removed from a story. We've seen stories like this over and over and over again. Yes, there are good journalists who are trying to tell the truth. There are good journalists who are trying to uplift Palestinian stories and the genocide and the atrocities on the ground and blaming Israel as the aggressor. But these journalists are also being fought by their own editors, by their own newsrooms, and by their own government.
Tim, there is absolutely no doubt that there are genuine journalists, reporters willing to risk their lives to cover stories everywhere in the world, including Gaza. But when you look at the statement issued by the Committee to Protect Journalists, which talks about 4,000 international journalists flying to Israel to cover the story when none was allowed into Gaza, it brings about the whole notion about the narrative which is going to be ultimately prevailing, but also those Gazans who had to step in to cover the story at the risk of their own lives.
I think the important thing is to praise and promote good journalism where it exists. I'm very uncomfortable with generalizations about the media and all news platforms, because generalizations always turn out to be in some form untrue. As I say, we know that there has been a great deal of outstanding reporting about the conflict in Gaza. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think the New York Times has done a better job on this war, extraordinary, comprehensive coverage of a kind that almost no other news platform has achieved. That's not to say there aren't articles in the New York Times with which I agree or that I think should have been balanced differently. But in terms of actually producing details about this conflict, I think it has done an absolutely exceptional job. And there are other instances. Al Jazeera's coverage has been extraordinary against some of the most challenging circumstances for your own staff and obviously for your own operations within Israel. I think it's much more important to make the point about how comprehensive have been the attempts to frustrate media coverage, how the international media were locked out of Gaza, how news platforms like Al Jazeera have been closed down, how domestic news platforms like Haaretz in Israel have been targeted by aggressive, disruptive government policies. I think making this point and continuing to make this point, as well as petitioning for journalists to be allowed in, is a more productive use of air than criticising things that are in the past and we can't change.
Ashish, if you look at what happened over this year, since October the 7th, the general consensus among many organizations was basically to cautiously deal with figures coming out of Gaza, saying that these are figures coming from Hamas-led government. But because you don't have international media there to balance that narrative, it seems that the Gazans themselves suddenly found themselves completely alone, isolated, with no tools whatsoever to defend their story, or at least to convince the world that their own stories are genuinely honest stories.
I think there's a deeper point there about inherent racism in our society, frankly. To address my colleague's point a minute ago, I think the media platform should now be saying you should only be trusting journalists out of Gaza. We can't get in. So to your point about let's put the criticism aside, why are they not platforming every Gazan journalist, every media outlet, right? Maybe our media outlets don't like brown journalists in there. I'm just being real. Let's just be real about this. We should inherently be trusting those guys. Some of those guys work for Al Jazeera. Some of those people work for other outlets, but they don't work for Western outlets, so we might not trust them. Now, it also addresses the next point about Hamas. Like, it's like, why shouldn't we trust Hamas figures? They were elected. People keep reminding us that the Gazan people elected Hamas. Well, they've run that region for ages, or that territory for a long time. So why shouldn't we trust them? Why are they not to be trusted, but Israel is to be trusted? Why is America to be trusted? Frankly, America and England, and again about media complicity, did commit a pretty big atrocity in Iraq that took years and years of investigations to find out. Only networks to cover it correctly, Al Jazeera at the time. Right, 800,000 people. Media were embedded there and yet didn't tell the stories of the massacres on the ground. It took a leak from WikiLeaks. What happened to those journalists? Where were those Western journalists? Why weren't they telling the truth? This is a story of Western journalists and how they act in the Middle East and what stories they choose to be true. And that this consent for the massacres that you're seeing and the genocide you're seeing in Gaza wasn't just manufactured today. It started post 9/11. Mm-hmm. It's been running through Iraq. It's all the way through. And the reason they continually use the Hamas-run health ministry, or now the Hezbollah-run health hospital in Beirut, mm-hmm. the reason they use that is we've spent 20 plus years saying these individuals are terrorists, they're bad guys. And that's sunk into the American and British psyche in the world that these guys are the bad guys. So we can't trust anything that comes out of there because people don't inherently look. I just want to finish this point quickly. This is really a really, really important thing. Only 28 countries believe these two groups are terrorists. Just remember that. All those 28 countries are white dominant countries. The rest of the world views them either as resistance groups or freedom fighters. And they are reporting facts, frankly, whether you go from South Africa to Malaysia to China, wherever you want to go with. Like, they are reporting the facts more fairly, like Al Jazeera, than the Western media that we put on a platform.
I have different angles to cover with you, so I appreciate if you can give me some short answers. Laura, do you think that the absence of the international media was one of the reasons why there's been very little understanding of the suffering of the people, but also appreciation of the reality of the conflict itself and the scope of the devastation and damage?
I think we've seen the scope of the devastation and damage. I think we need to give credit to the Palestinian journalists on the ground who have been reporting to us, not just in Arabic, but also in English, to reach the Western audiences. Yes, of course, we need to acknowledge as well that organizations like the New York Times, like CNN, they have contracted people on the ground to show atrocities. However, it's a noble thought to look at the glass half full, as my colleague is trying to say, that we need to praise the good coverage. But that's not important when the glass half full is full with blood, the blood of the Palestinian people. I think that the New York Times in particular had published lies about sexual political violence that were debunked by their own reporters. I think that they contract people who have spouses and children who serve in the Israeli military that has killed Palestinians. I don't think that that's a trusted news organization, regardless of its legacy, regardless of its history. It is a news organization that has blood on its hands.
Tim, let's look at what happened in Gaza. So in the absence of international media, the brave Gazan journalists, some of them citizen journalists, some of them just brave young people who decided to step in and cover the story. But guess what? They were not properly trained. They were intentionally targeted, and many of them lost their lives covering the story. There is a sense of moral responsibility there, and the media is to blame. Trade unions are to blame. The world is to blame. Key players are to blame because we left them alone to tell the story when they were not prepared.
Well, I have to say I've not seen any evidence that people with insufficient experience or training worked as journalists and lost their lives as a result of that lack of training. I do know that, and you know, I've spoken with Gazan journalists weekly throughout this conflict, that they have suffered the most extraordinary privations. They have all lost their homes, almost all have had bereavements. There is very little food in Gaza. There is very little fuel, so they carry their broadcast equipment to assignments on their shoulders. They've continued working despite that, and they've done that partly because they've been supported by their trades union, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, which in turn has been supported by my organisation, the International Federation of Journalists. We have provided 3 solidarity centres in different parts of Gaza from which journalists are able to work. We've provided food, we've provided clothing, we've provided shelter. We've done everything in our power to try and enable them to carry on doing the job that they and I believe is deeply, deeply important for the world. And that is for as many people as possible to see the scale of the injury to where they live and to the people of Gaza, and to make that a story that nobody on earth can fail to see and fail to be appalled at.
Ashish, in less than 40 seconds, if you don't mind, is it just going to be a perpetuation of the same tradition, which is basically any other conflict in the underdeveloped world? Those who die are not really a big priority for the world?
I mean, I think again, when I want to talk about media, I want to focus specifically on Western media. I think the reality is Western media will only cover Western interests. They've done this historically from the British Empire through to the US imperialism and what we've seen in the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, cover up after cover up of like atrocities in the region. And now we're seeing it in Gaza. So yes, the developing world, the global South, should not be looking to Western media as its like platform to find out the truth, frankly.
Well, Ashish Prashar, Tim Dawson, Laura Albast, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you. Looking forward to having a similar conversation in the near future with you. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.